people say I was the wisest man who ever lived. Well, wisdom begins by asking hard questions, even when they challenge our favorite theories. So grab a beer and let's see whether Egypt's new chronology really stands the test, or whether one determined scholar found the cracks. Cheers.
I'm Professor Kenneth Hanson, professor with a Pilsner, inviting you to grab your favorite beverage because today we're serving up one of the biggest debates in biblical archaeology. If you've been following Biblical Mysteries on Tap, you already know that I'm a fan of David Rohl's new chronology. His reconstruction of Egyptian chronology places Joseph, the Exodus, and the conquest of Canaan into a completely different Egyptian timeline. And suddenly, a whole series of archaeological puzzles begin to make remarkable sense. But every good theory deserves its toughest critics, and today we're meeting one of them. His name is John Bimson. John Bimson. Now, here's what makes this really interesting. See, Bimson isn't one of those minimalist scholars who thinks the Exodus never happened. Quite the opposite. He believes the Bible preserves genuine history. He also believes that the conventional chronology has serious problems. He even agrees that Egyptian chronology needs revision. So, why doesn't he embrace David Rohl? Well, pour another drink, because the disagreement isn't about whether history is wrong. It's about how wrong. Let's consider this strange alliance. One of the surprises in Bimson's little book, When Did It Happen?, is that he actually begins by praising Rohl. He acknowledges that Rohl's work has made thousands of people think seriously about biblical archaeology again. He admits that the conventional chronology has genuine cracks. He even agrees that archaeology shouldn't be allowed to drift so far from the biblical narrative that the two never meet. In other words, this isn't an atheist attacking a believer. It's one revisionist telling another revisionist, I think you've gone too far. And that immediately makes this debate a lot more interesting, which brings us to the 350-year problem. Now, Rohl's biggest move is famous. He shortens Egyptian history by almost 350 years. That's a long time, 3.5 centuries. But that allows him to identify Joseph, the biblical Joseph, with the Middle Kingdom, to identify the Exodus with the collapse of the 13th dynasty, and King Saul and King David with the Amarna correspondence, the famous Amarna correspondence of Egypt. Ramses II can be identified as the biblical Shishak, and Akhenaten, the famous monotheistic pharaoh, as nearly contemporary with King David. Now that's breathtaking, and a lot of people think a little bit too far. And Bimson admits exactly that. The problem, he says, is that the evidence just won't stretch that far. In his opinion, Rohl's reduction isn't impossible because it's radical. No, it's impossible because it creates even larger problems elsewhere. Next, Jericho becomes the first casualty. Now we arrive at one of the most fascinating disagreements. You see, both men agree that Jericho's destruction belongs with Joshua, and that alone separates them from much mainstream scholarship, which denies any connection with the biblical narrative at all. But when did it happen? Years before Rohl, Bimson himself argued that Joshua's conquest belonged in the Middle Bronze Age. And Rohl actually adopted much of this thinking. But then, according to Bimson, Rohl pushed the Exodus still earlier by identifying the abandonment of Tel El Daba's stratum G with the Exodus. Tel El Daba, which was a settlement that surely housed a lot of ancient Semitic people. It's an amazing archaeological find. But to say stratum G of Tel El Daba, when that was abandoned, that's the Exodus? That forced Jericho's destruction about 150 years earlier than the pottery evidence allows. For Bimson, the archaeology just refuses to cooperate. He argues that Jericho falls at the very end of the Middle Bronze Age, not halfway through it, as Rohl argues. So Rohl's synchronization, ingenious though it is, just collapses under ceramic chronology. Well, now it's time for the Samaria problem, and that's a big one, the Samaria problem. It's what Bimson calls another fatal objection. Samaria, according to the biblical book of Kings, Omri founded in the 9th century before the Common Era. Simple enough, except Rohl's revised chronology would require the earliest pottery there to belong to the late Bronze Age. Okay, what's the problem with that? Well, it doesn't. The pottery belongs to Iron Age 1. Now that may sound like dry archaeology, but let me tell you, pottery is the ancient world's calendar. It's all about pots. If your pottery says Iron Age, you can't just declare it late Bronze Age because that's what your theory needs it to be. Bimson argues that this creates one of the strongest archaeological objections to Rohl's entire reconstruction. 350 years is just too much. It's way too long. And that may be Bimson's central criticism. He's not opposed to lowering Egypt's states. He just doesn't believe they can be lowered that much. Genealogies, dynastic successions, foreign synchronisms all begin to strain if nearly 3.5 centuries just vanish, just disappear. So what's his conclusion? Well, about 250 years is probably the absolute maximum reduction you can make. And even that might be optimistic. In other words, he accepts a revised chronology, just not Rohl's revised chronology. But wait, doesn't Bimson reject conventional chronology too? Yeah, he does. And this is where things get really interesting. Bimson points to the work of Peter James and the authors of a book called Centuries of Darkness. That's the text, Centuries of Darkness. It's a famous book that argued that the conventional chronology of Egypt contains enormous dark ages, periods where archaeology just refuses to line up across the whole Eastern Mediterranean. Rather than shortening Egyptian history by 350 years, they recommend something closer to 250 years. Now, Bimson thinks this solves many of the same archaeological anomalies without producing the collateral damage caused by Rohl's system. Next topic, Shishak or not.
Perhaps the biggest surprise comes when Bimson discusses Shishak. You've probably heard the standard identification. Biblical Shishak equals Pharaoh Shoshenq I. Rohl rejects that identification completely. He identifies Shishak. That's me, with Ramses II. Cheers.
Bimson, he says, hold on. The conventional identification isn't nearly as airtight as many people think. Jerusalem doesn't appear on Shoshenq's victory list. Many of King Rehoboam's fortified cities, that's the northern Israelite King Rehoboam, many of his cities don't appear either. The geographical overlap just isn't nearly as perfect as often claimed. So Bimson actually agrees that the Shishak problem deserves another look. He just doesn't think Rohl's answer is the right one. Now, here's the twist. At this point, you may think Bimson has dismantled revisionism. Not even close. He argues the opposite. He believes conventional chronology is already under enormous pressure. He cites growing evidence that the third intermediate period probably should be shortened. He points to respected Egyptologists who admit there are genuine chronological problems. He even quotes James Hoffmeyer, the venerable James Hoffmeyer, one of Egyptology's most respected scholars, who acknowledges that revisionists have identified real problems. Not necessarily solved them, but identified them. Next.
Solomon makes a comeback. This is one of my favorite sections. Bimson argues that if late bronze dates move downward, Solomon suddenly fits remarkably well into the archaeological record. Those magnificent ivories, the cosmopolitan architecture, international artistic influences, luxury goods from Egypt and Syria. That's me in a nutshell. Cheers.
Instead of belonging centuries before Solomon, they begin looking exactly like the world Kings describes. Ironically, this is one of the places where Bimson and Rohl are pulling in the same direction. Both think archaeology can support the biblical monarchy. They just disagree on how far the clock needs to move. And we have to ask, what about Joseph?
Bimson spends surprisingly little time attacking Rohl's Joseph identification. He summarizes Rohl's proposal: Joseph as vizier under Senusret III, his link to Tel el-Daba, the famine inscriptions, and the famous Asiatic official's tomb, but he doesn't devote an extended refutation to it. Instead, his focus remains on the broader chronological framework. Cheers.
That's worth noticing. For Bimson, the foundation is the problem. Fix the chronology, and only then evaluate individual identifications. So, who wins? Well, here's where I'll offer my own perspective. Bimson wrote this critique in 2003. Since then, new discoveries have entered the conversation. Tel el-Daba has continued to be excavated. Ancient DNA studies have transformed archaeology. High-resolution radiocarbon dating has become far more sophisticated. The debate has evolved. Even so, Bimson's criticisms remain among the most thoughtful challenges ever written against David Rohl, not because they dismiss him, but because they take him seriously. And that's exactly what good scholarship is supposed to do. Last call. So, where does that leave us? John Bimson says, yes, Egyptian chronology needs fixing. Yes, conventional archaeology has real problems. Yes, biblical history deserves another hearing. But no, David Rohl moves the clock too far. Whether you agree with Bimson or Rohl, one thing is certain: the chronology of ancient Egypt is far less settled than many people imagine. And that means the story of Joseph, the Exodus, the conquest, and the rise of Israel may still hold surprises waiting beneath the sands. So next time someone tells you the chronology is settled, hey, raise your glass, smile, and remember, in biblical archaeology, sometimes the biggest mystery isn't what happened, it's when. Thanks for joining me for another episode of Biblical Mysteries on Tap. If you enjoyed this deep dive, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell. Next time, we'll ask an even bigger question. Did David Rohl answer Bimson's objections, or does the new chronology still have unresolved cracks? Until then, keep questioning, keep digging, and keep your mug full.